Disclaimer, a copy of Team Sonic Racing was provided to me by Sega. With the release of Team Sonic Racing, I've been thinking a lot about the Blue Blur's endeavors into the racing genre. From strange kart racing crossovers with NASCAR racer Danica Patrick to stranger, far worse hoverboarding crossovers with the Xbox Kinect, and even featuring one of the most recent appearances of Banjo and Kazooie almost a decade ago, these games have been all over the map. Despite how many different gameplay styles these games have had, some of them stand up favorably next to the best in the genre. But I'm not exactly a massive enough Sonic fan to have the be-all end-all ranking of these games, so I've brought along local Sonic nerd MykonosFan with me so that he can take the brunt of the hate that you're about to drop on us.
Yes, I'm the hate magnet. Where does Sonic's newest racing game land compared to its predecessors? Is it the best Sonic racer, or one of the weakest? Which game on this list features alien genies?
What?
Join us today to find out. And if you want a more direct scoop on Team Sonic Racing, Bolt and I reviewed the game together over on Find the Computer Room.
Before we start with the worst of the worst, I do have one quick note that I want to make. We're not going to be talking about specific modes here, only dedicated racing games. That means no Sonic Adventure Go-Karts or Sonic 2, 3, or Mania multiplayer races or Chow Garden races or anything like that. We're also not counting those 3 Japan-only Java phone racing games because you haven't played them either and you know it. With that in mind, I'm going to start by sending us to the deep, dark crypt of motion controls. The Sonic Riders trilogy is a bit of a strange one, throwing Sonic and the gang into races on hoverboards that use air as fuel. In the first 2 games in the Riders series, you could argue this worked incredibly well, and those 2 have become cult classics among some Sonic fans. But in 2010's Sonic Free Riders,
this game relies on the Xbox Kinect, which means that it is a racing game that relies on an iffy at best control mechanism. It was received so poorly that it basically killed the sub-series, which, while not a huge loss, is still a bit of a shame since I actually enjoyed the other entries well enough for what they were. We'll get into those in a bit, but in short, this game works about as well as most Kinect cash-in games, which is to say, not at all. Look, just don't play this game. It's not worth your time, not even as a joke. I wish I was exaggerating for the sake of hyperbole, but when it came to the few races I played to prepare for this video, I did better when I stopped trying to actually play the game. I really wish Sonic Free Riders was better, I truly do. A more casual Riders game with Kinect controls is actually a decent idea on paper. As it stands though, Free Riders is really only memorable for introducing most of the current voice cast in the main series. It also has some okay music, but it's a Sonic game, so that's to be expected.
Number 8 on our list is a sort of twofer, because the Sonic Drift games are pretty close to identical, at least as far as quality is concerned. Released in 1994 and 1995, these 2 Game Gear titles pit Sonic and the crew head-to-head in a terrible take on most 1990s pseudo-3D racing games. Credit where it's due here, the games look incredibly good by Game Gear standards. Yes, the backgrounds are just one scrolling image with no real depth. Yes, the game only plays on the bottom half of the Game Gear's already tiny screen. Imagine watching this footage on a screen half the size of your phone, and then remember that half of that is just the track map. And yes, the alternating shades of road are an eyesore, but all things considered, I can respect what was made here, even if it's just atrocious to play. The tiny game window means that you barely have any track ahead of you on the horizon, so you have to rely on the turning markers that show up on the side of the road. Problem is they don't always show up at the right spot, so you might turn too late and run yourself off the road.
And with how fast this game is, most tracks take 20 to 30 seconds per lap. You can't really flick your eyes up for a moment to see the track map, because if you do, you're going to lose your spot and again, run off the side of the road. With only an accelerate and a brake/drift button, it's a bit tough to keep yourself in the middle of the road to pick up the rings or items that may show up. Each character can spend some rings to use their special ability, which can be a speed boost, an attack, or a jump, essentially the same effect as the game's items.
While mechanically they're just about identical, there are a few differences between the games. In Drift 1, you can only play as Sonic, Eggman, Tails, and Amy, while in 2, Knuckles, Metal Sonic, and Fang the Sniper are brought into the mix. If you don't know who Fang is, don't worry, neither does Sega.
2's computer opponents are much more adept compared to 1, which, combined with more challenging track designs, makes it a significantly harder game, I'd argue. Considering the games already didn't control well to begin with, that makes Drift 2 a significantly more frustrating game too.
If nothing else, the Drift games are super short, so they're not painful for long. Each of them has 3 Chaos Emerald difficulties that bring new track layouts to either game's 6 level styles. Drift 1 takes directly after Sonic 1's levels, while 2 kind of moves into its own world a little bit more. Again though, with tracks that are almost never even 2 minutes long, you can finish both games in about 30 minutes each, which conveniently matches the Game Gear's battery life. I think my favorite thing about these games is that Drift 1 was never released outside of Japan back in the day, but for whatever reason Drift 2 never had its name changed when it was brought to the West. That must have driven Game Gear collectors insane looking for a copy of Drift 1 that simply never existed.
Number 7 on the list is yet again a twofer, because just like with Sonic Drift, we've got two portable Sonic racing games that were released a year apart. In an ironic twist, these two racing games were never released in Japan. Apparently even Sega wanted to spare its home country of these two. I'm talking, of course, about Sonic Rivals 1 and 2, released in November 2006 and 2007 respectively.
While these two PSP games share some similarities with the Drift series on paper, mechanically they couldn't be any further apart. The Rivals games function more as platformers than they do traditional racing games, taking more after Sonic's 2D side-scrolling roots. Both Rivals games control just about the same, as you'll be taking your character of choice in constant head-to-head races against your opponents, often for no good reason at all. In fact, for the entire story mode of both games, you can expect everything to be a race, all the way down to the boss fights. That would be fine if these games weren't two of the least fun experiences that I've had in recent memory. The opponent's AI is just plain stupid, essentially coming to a flat-out stop if you get too far behind, and rubber banding right up into your hedge hole if you get a sizable lead. And don't even get me started on Rivals 1's boss battles. My opponent never hit the boss a single time. Not once. But arguably the biggest sin in the Rivals games, even above the rubber banding, is the dreadful level design.
In the Rivals games, plastered pretty much every 20 feet are these little blocks you have to jump over, because Sonic Rivals wants to make sure you never gain any semblance of speed. Every single time you run into one of these, your character will slowly parkour over them, and a lovely QuickTime event prompt will pop up. There's usually no real penalty for missing or ignoring them, and you'll usually get a slight boost into the air if you press the right button. X, it's usually X. But these have hurt me just as often as they've helped. I've been launched up onto a higher platform only to run right into an enemy. I've been launched into a pit. Not only do these things slow the game down, they actively hinder what could have been half-decent levels.
It also doesn't help that your character is just about in the center of the screen no matter what you are doing, meaning that you can't really see all that far ahead. In both racing games and platformers, that is a recipe for disaster. Rivals 2 is better looking, has more content, features full voice acting instead of just single word grunts, and is altogether more fleshed out than the first game, but I wouldn't recommend either of these games by any stretch of the imagination. Thankfully, like the Drift games, most levels will be over in 2 to 3 minutes tops, and after about 10 minutes you'll have seen everything these games have to offer. Or at least the game says I'm only taking 2 to 3 minutes, but I swear it feels like these games have chaos control or something. Even a 2-minute level felt like it had to be at least triple that. I'll be totally frank here, these games are pretty much tied with Drift. It may as well be 8A and 8B for these. The only reason this one's ranked higher is because fewer of you will yell at me that way. Also, while the Rivals games have an absolutely dreadful main theme, the theme for the number 6 game on this list is far, far more iconic. Released in 1997 on the Sega Saturn, Sonic R is... it's something, that's for sure. On practically every level, this game is incredibly divisive. From the weird tanky controls to the love it or hate it soundtrack, there's just about no middle ground here. Regardless of how you feel, I'm sorry, I don't know why I said that. There's no question that Sonic R certainly isn't a 3-course meal. With only 5 levels and 10 characters, many of which you could argue are just alternate versions of other characters, this is the kind of game that's only gonna hold most players over for maybe a couple hours tops. Also, I just want to stress that this game came out in 1997, about a year and a half after Mario 64. I won't go as far to say that the game controls poorly, but I think that the wide, often directionless track layouts help cover for them for sure.
Look, Sonic R is a delicious slice of meme pie, but only when you're not actually playing it. It's definitely a neat historical curiosity for the Sonic series, being the only original 3D Sonic game on the Sega Saturn that actually released, but putting aside the songs and interesting quirks like the Tails doll, this game just isn't fun. It says a lot that Sonic R is number 6 in this video, and 2 of the spots below it are ones we combined. Unfortunately, the strength of memes and the strength of its fantastic soundtrack are quite powerful, which is why we have to put this one as high as we are. Sonic R really only exists now as an excuse for Richard Jocks to write songs with 90s house piano, and it accomplishes just that. Sonic Riders Zero Gravity is the first game in this video to feature any solid mechanical depth, and arguably it might have a bit too much. The Riders series is a bit notorious for having steep difficulty curves, and while Zero Gravity brings some neat ideas to the table that I want to become adept at, I just can't shake the notion that it's all too much. This may just be me sucking at the game due to playing with a D-pad thanks to the sideways Wii remote, but its systems just don't seem to jive together the way they did in its previous entry. I can't put my finger on it, but Zero Gravity just doesn't feel as rewarding to play.
The main thing this game brings to the table is the zero gravity mechanic, which allows you to burn your fuel gauge to greatly manipulate the angle of your turn. From a presentation standpoint, this is awesome, but regardless, this mechanic forces the tracks to be wider and have longer gaps that don't necessarily equate to more interesting gameplay. Again, that boost is really neat once you know what to do, and once in a while you can find a neat shortcut from it, but I just don't feel that it was a net positive.
Zero Gravity does have a few better ideas to its credit, however. To give one example, in the first Sonic Riders, characters were split into 3 classes, with each having an inherent ability. Speed characters are able to grind on rails for shortcuts, for instance. In Zero Gravity, these character abilities are actually tied to the hoverboard you choose for a character. This is a neat idea, as it can basically allow you to play any character with any shortcut choice you want. Following that example though, the only downside to this is that you have to collect enough rings in a race to unlock the ability to grind. The vehicle you choose, not only are there hoverboards, but also roller skates and air rides, Kirby, eat your heart out, can also have other effects to unlock during the race, and while it's a cool idea, I kinda prefer the simplicity of the first game, where collecting rings in a race just levels you up and increases your stats. Basically, the gist here is that Zero Gravity is a more complicated racing game, easily the most complex one in this entire video. The more time you put into mastering it, the more you'll get out of it. The game also looks rather nice for its time, and it absolutely has the best soundtrack of the Riders subseries. I guess I should mention the game's plot, because it has one. Basically, this game asserts that the Babylon rogues are descended from alien genies. Coupling that with how awkwardly the dialogue is delivered in these poorly done cutscenes, look, this story really isn't worth much more than the basic mention, and while I don't care for it at all, I do respect that it just went nuts rather than taking itself seriously. All in all though, I just can't help but prefer the way the first Riders feels to play in its relative simplicity. On that note, it's rather eye-opening seeing Sonic Riders in the 4th spot for this video, because while I enjoy the game a fair bit due to basically having it down to muscle memory, there's quite a gulf in quality between this and the 3rd spot on this list. Sonic Riders is a hard game to get the hang of thanks to controls that really don't feel intuitive. If you just handed this game off to someone that enjoys Mario Kart, for example, they'll probably look at you like you just handed them a bomb. But once you take the time to beat your head against the wall a bit, there's a totally competent, dare I say, rewarding racing game hiding just a few layers deep.
So like we mentioned before, Riders forces players to juggle between keeping their air fuel tank filled, keeping an eye out for shortcuts, pulling off jumps and doing tricks in the air for added speed and fuel, and gathering rings to level up their ride. As a character levels up, their air capacity, boost speed, and stats will increase. You're also expected to get the hang of a drift system that, frankly, just doesn't feel good at all until you've adjusted to how bad it feels. Once you know what to expect from the game's drifting, you can pull off some ridiculously gratifying turns, but I couldn't fault anyone who doesn't want to learn the game to that degree.
Once you do have it down, this game has a silly story mode with even worse acting than Zero Gravity, but there are no alien ancestors in this title, so it's already more grounded and a bit less silly. Your mileage will vary on if that's good or bad. There's also a mission mode, which doesn't really stand out in my memory, aside from having some super challenging tasks buried within it. I really wasn't as into these, but if you're going deep into Sonic Riders, you may enjoy a challenge and be up to the task. More content is always a good thing, unless it's Sonic Rivals. Riders is really just a lot to swallow at first, and while it's definitely an uphill climb, if you're going to try any of the Riders titles, this is the one to go with. You're going to hate it before you enjoy it, but as far as Sonic's 15th anniversary titles go, well, you could do worse. Like Rivals.
While we're here, one of the cooler things about Riders is that it sort of accidentally laid the groundwork for future Sonic racing games by letting you play as non-Sonic characters. Super Monkey Ball's Ai, Knights, and Ooh La La from Space Channel 5 are all playable, and there's even a couple of Sega-themed racetracks that are really fun to experience.
They're not as fun to actually play compared to other tracks in the game, but as someone whose first game console was a Dreamcast with Sonic Adventure and Crazy Taxi, there's just something amazing about hailing Axel as a cabbie so he can give you a shortcut. As fun as this fan service is, however, there are a couple games that take this idea to the next level.
If all of the games thus far were classic Sonic Racing, then this part of the list definitely starts the section we would call modern Sonic Racing. I'm sorry, I don't know why I keep saying these things. The top 3 Sonic Racing games ever made are the 3 kart racers made by Sumo Digital, and let me just say that you really can't go wrong with any of these as an alternative to the King of the Mountain, Mario Kart. Number 3 specifically is Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing. Released in 2010, despite looking more like a 2008 kind of game with some rather questionable visuals, All-Stars Racing introduced the fundamentals that numbers 2 and 1 on this list would later build off of.
Depending on the version you're playing, you can choose from one of about 20 characters, over a third of which are, naturally, from the Sonic franchise. In addition to your usual Sonic cast though, you can also play as some characters from throughout Sega's game library, like Alex Kidd, BD Joe from Crazy Taxi, and Yo from Shenmue. This game also has some fantastic deep cuts, like the mice from Choo Choo Rocket and even the Bonanza Brothers. That's just awesome. If you're playing on Xbox 360 or the Wii, you can use your avatar or Mii's as a bonus racer. And Xbox 360 owners even got Banjo and Kazooie in what would be the duo's final new appearance to date, Minecraft skins notwithstanding. Guh?
Here's hoping the comment section can say we're wrong about that one soon. Microsoft, please, don't let Banjo die like this. The tracks, like the characters, range across several different Sega franchises, split into 8 different themes based on the different series, from Seaside Hill from Sonic Heroes to 3 Jet Set Radio tracks set in Tokyoto, all the way to the Kurian Mansion from House of the Dead. Not every character has a home track, but every course feels pretty distinct from one another despite sharing a general theme with at least its 2 sibling tracks. Most of them feel excellently designed for All-Stars Racing's beautiful controls, which is good because so many of these tracks are adapted in ASR's 2 sequels, so I'm glad they had a good base to jump from. I will say that when compared to its sequels, those controls are a tad bit loose for my liking, but the drifting feels fast and satisfying. The game is pretty much constantly running at a lightning speed, and the race announcer yelling updates about who's overtaking whom or who just used an item, it all adds this incredible, raw feeling to the mix.
On top of the regular tracks, there are 3 battle mode stages for you to duke it out, either online or in local multiplayer, as well as your usual Grand Prix Cups and a whopping 64 customized missions that will challenge you to complete unique objectives. These can range from collecting rings to winning a race while starting from behind to drifting as long as you possibly can. They're nothing super special, but that's a lot of bonus content to help flesh out the game for those times when you don't have buddies to play with. That'll also be a recurring theme in the top 2 games, so keep that in your mind.
I would say the weakest point of this game are the items. After all, what's a good kart game without its weapons? It's got your usual mines, homing shots, green shells, and boost items, and some stranger ones like a horn item that came years before Mario Kart did it. Sadly, with the exception of 1 or 2, these are mostly generic items that aren't taken from Sega games at all, and that leaves the game feeling a bit more like just another generic Mario Kart clone than it otherwise would. Like, come on, the rocket could have easily been a choo-choo rocket, but instead we got Lucky Charms rainbows. That's a shame because everything else stacks up so incredibly well. Yes, I know each character has their own all-star special move that brings some life to the items, but they don't really make up for what could have been better items to begin with. With that one nitpick out of the way, you still really can't go wrong playing All-Stars Racing, but since it's the first game in the current trilogy, naturally the other 2 just do things at least a little bit better. 2019's Team Sonic Racing may as well be subtitled All-Stars Racing Rebooted, because Sumo's newest release takes so much from the previous game on this list.
About a third of TSR's 21 tracks are ripped and adapted right from ASR, and even some of the characters cut from All-Stars like Rouge and Vector are brought back into the mix here. The main tweak that Sumo brought to the formula here is the team-up gameplay focus, putting 4 teams of 3 into races. No longer is placing first good enough, now you've got to work together to make sure your entire team does well, or else even a first place finish could end up in a loss. When you're playing with friends, this can make for an incredibly hectic time, as you're boosting off of the slipstreams of your teammates, giving them skin boosts after they've been spun out by an item, or timing your team ultimate move, this game's version of the All-Star item, so that all 3 of you get the maximum boost. This combined with a fully fledged story mode, which is also playable locally with a team of up to 3, makes for a great couch game. And, of course, the game looks absolutely stunning. And when it runs at 60 frames per second, it's a dream.
Now, as we mentioned at the top of the video, we spent over 20 minutes diving into what makes Team Sonic Racing a great time, and many of the praises we would sing here would be ripped straight from that review. Instead, I would rather spend this time explaining why TSR is only the second best Sonic racing game. To do that, we first need to talk about the very best, and that brings us to number 1 on our list.
That's right. The actual number 1 best Sonic racing game are the Chow races, from Sonic Adventure 2 Battle specifically.
What?
You see,
no,
this
we said
version,
we weren't
ported
do
from
this.
the
I thought
Dreamcast,
we
was
talked
the
about this,
latest
dude. The Chow
and
Garden is
truly
overrated.
last
Stop bringing it up
incarnation
already.
of the
Oh my
A-Life
god.
system
All right,
until
cut
next
it,
journey
Mike.
of
If you've played Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, you already knew it was probably going to end up right here at the top. That's because not only is Transformed the best racer in the Sonic series, I would only put it behind Mario Kart as the second best karting game ever made. CTR and Diddy Kong Racing fans, eat your heart out. Part of Transform's lofty standing isn't just due to the Crash-esque near perfection of the drifting and handling mechanics of All-Stars Racing 1, or a sense of speed and momentum that finds a way to fly by Mario Kart's 150cc speed without moving into the absolute insanity that is 200cc. It's also thanks to its titular gimmick, which takes Diddy Kong's 3 racing styles and breathes new life into them in an amazing way. In almost every one of this game's 21 courses, the tracks and vehicles will transform at some point in the race.
Whether it's jumping from wheels on the ground into a boat race across the water, soaring from the sea into the sky in plane form, or flipping from the sky back into a drift on the road, this transforming gimmick is an absolutely stellar way to make every single lap memorable in what's often a somewhat static genre. This is part of where Team Sonic Racing struggles to keep up. Frankly, it's hard to scale back into a normal karting game after seeing what Transformed was able to do over half a decade prior.
This game has stuck out so strongly in my mind that even almost 6 years after I had last played it, I remembered most of the tracks down to every single turn. Even though I've put more hours into TSR already than I ever had Transformed, which surprised me by the way, I don't think that any of the newer game's far simpler courses will stand out even a few months from now. Hell, I just played this game yesterday and I still can't differentiate some of its tracks from one another. Plus, while they have the same number of tracks, only 4 of Transformed's were brought over from its predecessor, and that is a breath of fresh air compared to TSR's hefty recycling. On a more personal note, Transformed was one of my first real dives into Sega's other properties beyond just Sonic, and the amount of character that each of these other franchises had, how immediately I latched onto each one just based on the racers or the tracks alone, and the amount of love that went into this game have all stuck with me better than most games period, let alone kart racers. I mean, come on, one of the characters here morphs into an actual Dreamcast controller for its boat form. That alone makes this game a 10 out of 10. Now that I think about it, this character might be the subliminal reason for why I bought a Dreamcast.
And in addition to having more engaging content, it's simply just got more content. From your usual time trials and Grand Prix to the lengthy World Tour mode, which, to be fair, is a comparable length to TSR's Team Adventure mode, the usual fixtures are here. Every character has their own experience bar and progression, unlocking new stat layouts in the form of vehicle mods. And unlike Team Sonic Racing's mods, these allow you to tweak a character to your own liking, rather than what the developers thought players would want. Yes, some characters will always have a higher speed or handling stat than others, but you can manipulate any one stat just enough to make them perfect for you. And on the topic of characters, Transformed's roster is just insane. Console players were treated to crossovers like Wreck-It Ralph and actual NASCAR racer Danica Patrick, while PC players got crossovers from Team Fortress, Total War, and even Football Manager for some reason. And I know Bolt already mentioned it, but that Dreamcast character has to be one of the greatest secret characters in any game, period. They even put a microphone next to an actual Dreamcast to capture how obnoxiously loud the system's disc rating is, and incorporated it as part of the character. Sumo went all out to make this a definitive love letter to all things Sega, and while Team Sonic Racing is a fine Sonic game, that missing "and Sega" really brought it down a notch.
Simply put, there's just about nothing that Team Sonic Racing does that Transformed didn't do better. Without friends, TSR is still a solid game, but Transform's difficulty was so balanced that every single race felt so neck and neck that you could almost believe the computer players were real people. That's just not even close to there in Team. While I'm definitely glad that Sumo tried something new with Team Sonic Racing, and while that game is still great in its own right, every time I play it, I can't help but think about what could have been if they had made a sequel to Transformed instead of making a sequel to All-Stars 1. Despite having nearly 100% completed the game back in the day, I would buy a Switch port of Transformed in a heartbeat. Make it happen, Sega. After all, it's already on the Wii U anyway. Better yet, bring Sumo back for a fourth karting game and steer back towards Transformed, because I have no doubt in my mind that a Transformed sequel could not only overtake this game, it could put Sonic right back at the top of the karting podium. Do you agree with our ranking, or would you flip around some of this order? Make sure to share your rankings in the comments down below, and while you're down there, don't forget to hit the like button to help the channel grow, and subscribe if you're new here for more awesome videos like this every single week. Or so, I'm not always good about that. While you're at it, make sure you check out MykonosFan's channel too. His Please Play It series sustains me on those cold winter nights. Our Team Sonic Racing review over on Find the Computer Room is one of my favorite videos that I've been a part of yet, so if you want to find out whether it's worth that $40 price tag, click on this video on your screen. Lastly, shout out to all my patrons for helping make videos like this possible. As a special bonus for you guys for being awesome, I've got 7 unfiltered minutes worth of Chris rambling about the Chow Garden that had me laughing more than I'd like to admit. That audio I think will be up on both of our Patreon pages, so if you're a patron of either of us, make sure you give that a listen. As always everybody, stay golden.